Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the member for Cheltenham, who spoke so well and in such an informed manner, particularly on the demands and challenges of special educational needs. Can I just start by thanking all the great teachers and head teachers, leadership teams, the TAs, and indeed all the governors who provide their time voluntarily to provide some great schools. I'm very proud that I've got so many across the constituency of Warwick and Leamington. Madam Deputy Speaker, as far as I'm concerned, education is probably the greatest gift from one generation to the next. And of course, it always has been. But all that is changing, and I think it's changing incredibly quickly. From the wholesale closure of children's centres to the pressures on higher education, every facet and every sector of education is in or potentially faces a future funding crisis. But for the purposes of this debate, I wish to focus primarily on our schools and our colleges. In recent weeks, I've had the privilege to visit many of them, including Woodlows Primary School, Westgate, Telford, St Margaret's, Bishop's Tatchbrook and Clapham Terrace Primary Schools. Just 37 days ago, I visited one of them, a great little school, perhaps not so little, met the children, they're all highly motivated, took questions from years 5 and 6. They asked about climate change, plastics in our environment, even on Brexit and the impact of Brexit on exchange rates. I thought this was pretty tough. But then I got talking to the head teacher who confided about the £50,000 he was going to have to find sometime that day in a cut to the budget. He introduced me to a pupil with special needs. A child needs one-to-one support, but the school can't afford it. So the head teacher is left trying to square a very difficult circle. And you know, since 2015, the school has lost over £340 per pupil. And of course, they are not alone. In fact, in this case, that sum of money is pretty typical across our primary schools. Then 32 days ago, I went to a special educational needs picnic in the constituency. It was brilliantly organised by some wonderful parents, Cassie, Ellie, Fru, Helen and Emma, that brought parents together from across Warwickshire to give them a voice and to speak about the crisis we are facing in SEND funding. The parents are desperate. Their children are being squeezed out, as we've heard from across the floor, of mainstream education by schools that cannot afford to teach them, schools that can only provide a limited number of hours a day or week, such that the children spend much of their time at home. And children, some of the most vulnerable in our society, that are being denied a full education. You know, it all sounds faintly Victorian. But I cannot blame the schools, and nor do they. They do blame the government. 11 days ago, I hosted a meeting for parents of a local secondary school. 60 people attended. They feel anger and frustration. Just 9 months ago, only days before the start of the academic year, the head teacher was suspended, the governors dissolved, and an IEB introduced. Months later, and the sixth form is facing closure, and the school is facing significant cuts. The pupils and parents are being left in limbo. Their choice is limited, and having to look around for alternative sixth form provision. As if that's going to be easy. Earlier in the week, I was talking by chance to a sixth form student at another secondary school who had just finished her A-levels. Her story well illustrates the destruction of provision and choice available to this next generation. Like several of her friends, she wanted to study politics, but there were too few of them, just 6, so the choice was withdrawn. So she took German instead, but soon found herself that the teaching staff had to be cut and lost, so she ended up teaching herself for her final year. So what chance for her? And then 10 days ago, I visited another primary school, again in Warwick. I met the school council. The head teacher talked me through the financial crash they have faced. They've lost £97,000 since 2015-16. That's £511 per pupil. They've lost 2 teaching assistants, yet the school is just 200 pupils. The head teacher is having to cover for SEND in the absence of significant SENCO staff. And as a result, it is typical of the school to have up to 3 SEND pupils excluded at any one time. As if this was not enough, the future appears even more bleak. A £35,000 deficit next year, followed by a £140,000 deficit the year after. And of course, they are not alone either. All our primary schools across the area are facing a crisis. One in South Leamington has lost almost £650 per pupil. Similarly, a school in North Leamington has had to cut £570 per pupil and 6 TAs. And in Whitnash, one of the schools has lost £540 per pupil. Huge sums for these schools to have to face up to. But it's not just primaries, but our superb nursery schools, such as Warwick and Whitnash, are also facing massive financial pressures. And of course, since 2013, we've seen the dismantling of our precious children's centres. In Warwickshire, the government's funding cuts, together with the failure to raise sufficient monies by claiming zero council tax increases, has seen the wholesale closure of the children's centres, with 26 of 39 being closed. As the member for East Worthing and Shoreham rightly observed, the first 1,001 days are critical for both child and parent, yet we're seeing the withdrawal of these services for many in our community. And across Warwickshire, the bigger picture is pretty bleak. Schools have lost £50 million in total since 2015. That's an average of £244 per child. And it's not as if Warwickshire already had very high per pupil funding. It has the 120th out of 140 in terms of lowest per pupil funding. But it's easy to talk about these cuts in the abstract. These cuts are extremely damaging to our children, to their parents, to the teaching staff. But it is also damaging, as we've heard elsewhere, to our society, to our communities, for which these schools are so often the very centre, the heartbeat of them. But also to our cultural wealth and to our economy, as my right honourable friend, the member for Durham, illustrated so well earlier on. How can it be that we've cut music, arts and design, languages from the provision and choice of so many? It is increasingly the preserve of private schools for these sorts of subjects to be provided, and it has to be a concern that for so many in our society they are being denied that choice. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid to say it, but I think the parents of Warwick and Leamington appreciate it so well, that the government is failing the next generation. It cannot be right that so many young people are being denied the education they deserve, or that will ultimately serve this country well. But they're also being failed in the protections they need, whether it be the safeguarding or in mental health provision in our schools. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I conclude by saying that I agree with the notion of a 10-year education plan, as mentioned by the Honourable Member for Harlow. He's right. We need long-term planning. The schools are crying out for it. But that means nothing without the massive increase in investment that we need in our education system. And I would urge the Minister to fight hard for this come the spending review. But that would only benefit those in our schools, or being born rather, today. As it stands, this government has failed this next generation, and those young people, let down by an ideology born from austerity, will never forget it.